Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this right here is the Cayin Fantasy. Obviously this is an IEM, but if you've heard of Cayin before, you've probably heard of them because of their digital audio players. In fact, I think it was late last year I reviewed this little guy right here. I've got it sitting here, the Cayin N3 Pro digital audio player. Quite liked it, and I was pretty interested when Cayin decided to do some IEMs. Now, Cayin's kind of known as being somewhat of a premium brand. Like, their stuff is not cheap, and the Cayin Fantasy accordingly is not a cheap IEM. This is around 800 bucks, and what you get for 800 bucks is a single dynamic driver earphone, which might not sound fancy, but there's some folks out there that really are quite addicted to the sound that you get out of a dynamic driver earphone. And when the prices get up, they start to be able to implement some different technologies, maybe go after really specific tuning and stuff like that. Anyway, there's a number of different single dynamic driver earphones that I've reviewed on the channel that have been more expensive. And some of them have paid off and some of them haven't. So I was pretty interested to see how Cayin would do with that. So anything else to talk about that dynamic driver? I mean, it's a 10.3 millimeter beryllium coated diaphragm. It's got dual cavities for the acoustic tuning if that matters to you, but really what matters is what does this thing actually sound like. So I've spent the past couple of weeks or so listening to this and comparing it to some other IEMs in its price range, including the Dunu Zen and the Moondrop Illumination, two other single dynamic driver earphones that each cost around $700 and $800. So this is going to be kind of an expensive table, but we'll get through it. And I guess we'll just start with the unboxing and what's in the box. But actually, just so I don't forget, if you're watching now live and you have any questions about the Fantasy, the Illumination, the Zen, or anything else that's going on, leave it in the live chat, because this is a live review like all my other reviews, and this is a good chance to have a conversation. If you're watching now and it's not live, if you missed the live, that's cool. That's fine. Just subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell so that YouTube lets you know next time I'm live, and then we can chat. But for now, let's just go to the table and talk about the Fantasy, which I think we can agree, well, I hope we can agree, it's a pretty handsome looking earphone. Let's go ahead and zoom in on this. Although I will start by talking about what's in the box. I think it is worth beholding for a moment how handsome this thing is. All right, back to the box and the contents. First of all, I don't usually talk about unboxings during these sorts of videos, but I will just do a quick demonstration of a really nice unbox. It's got, in fact, these little drawers, and the reason I'm doing this is so that you can actually see all of the ear tips, which I didn't want to take out of this drawer, but quite the selection of ear tips, including where they've got balance type, vocal type, they've got foam ear tips, biflange ear tips, and of course, bass ear tips. Now, whenever I've experimented with tips before in the past, they'll make some small differences, but not usually massive differences. But yeah, that's the tip collection that comes in there. And then also you get this pretty interesting little carrying pouch. It is quite simple, obviously very thin and probably not super protective, although there are individual compartments in there for storing the earpieces. But I actually like the simplicity of this thing. It's just, that's actually something I could imagine myself using. It came with a shirt clip of some sort, not sure. I've never used one of these. It comes with a hairbrush, which I guess you could use for cleaning the nozzles, and a pair of tweezers, which is curious because I don't believe this came with any sorts of filters or anything, so I'm not totally sure what the tweezers are intended for, but it did come with tweezers. And then, of course, it also came with this kind of a microfibery type cleaning towel, which is kind of important because as we dive into the earphone itself, you can see that it is quite shiny, and let's see if I can do a demonstration of this. Quite prone to fingerprints. There you go. There's my forensic identity. But yeah, the earpieces themselves are really pretty nicely made. Like, they've got a nice weight to them. The whole earphone does, and it's not too heavy or anything like that, but it's got a nice weight to it that makes it feel fairly premium. Let's see if it's worth diving in. We can just do a little bit more of a tour of the unit itself so you can take a look at it. Got, you know, somewhat lengthy nozzles, but I did not find them to be problematic, neither too short nor too long for my ears, so generally pretty good. And I'll do a fit test in a second just to show you. But yeah, generally I found this to be a well-built earphone with a really nice aesthetic. I quite like it. In fact, even the cable I think is just a really nice match for it. The one issue I'm having with the cable, and you might be seeing me struggle with this, is these ear hooks are pretty aggressive. You can see that the ear hooks like bend past the earphone itself, and I find that's the thing that I've seen on some other earphones. Usually when that happens, it means that the cable is a little bit more tangly and a little bit harder to deal with. But if you were dedicated, you could actually just take a hair dryer to this and probably get a better bend out of it. I didn't do that. But yeah, that is the set. Let's take a look at the cable a little bit more in detail before I go to the fit test and see that honestly this is a pretty nice little cable. Punch in on that so you can take a look. It's fairly simple, just kind of a 2, maybe a 4-core twist, not a braid, but it is, I find, pretty handsome. Fortunately, that just looks like my Stream Deck just closed on me. So hold on while I fix that. Doing it live. It's not my Stream Deck. Pardon the interruption. But yeah, we were talking about this cable, which, it's got this actually pretty nice and weighty termination, just 3.5 millimeter termination, nothing super fancy, but that's actually what I like. And then as you can see, the cable wraps up quite nicely as well. So while I'm wrapping this thing up, I'm actually going to go ahead and unwrap it and throw it in my dome so you can take a look and see what the Fantasy looks like inside my ears. And yeah, I think generally, like, it fits pretty small, you can see. I found it honestly perfectly comfortable. It does have a little bit of these angled edges on it, which in some earphones could pose sort of a friction issue as it rubs on the inside of the ear, but I personally never had any issues with that myself. I found these, yeah, just generally pretty comfortable. Maybe not the most secure fitting, which is to say that, like, the shape of this is pretty generic. It's kind of common for dynamic driver earphones, honestly. Like balanced armature sets, it seems like manufacturers take a few more chances with making the earphones more contoured to the inside of your ear. These are a little bit more generic, as you can see as we zoom in on this. And so, like other dynamic driver earphones, or a lot of them, I would say security on these things is only okay. It's not bad, but it's only okay. So I think that's as much as I really wanted to talk about the physical stuff. Might as well just dive into talking about the sound. And like I typically do, I'll start with just the general sound signature of the Cayin Fantasy. And, I would say the general sound signature is, I would call it kind of a bright V. And V shape for me kind of, indicates some emphasis in bass, some emphasis in treble, maybe upper mid-range, but really not like a mid-range focused sound. And this, in terms of its V tuning, is very much on the bright side, which means that there's a lot more of that treble emphasis and less so of that bass emphasis. In fact, I would say this is not a very bassy set. If you're looking for a bassy set, I would stay away from something like the Fantasy. The bass is honestly kind of almost in line with neutral, although it's got a bit of a mid-bass bump to it, which gives it a decent amount of body and heft. But again, it's not quite neutral, but also still not really big on bass. What it is really quite big on, honestly, is that treble. And so that's why I will call this a bright V. You would say that this is kind of strong on clarity in terms of its general tune, not really thick. It's a little bit on the thin side, maybe quite a bit on the thin side. But it's got that decent bottom end to hold it up. And if you're familiar with something like the Moondrop SSR, as a tuning, I think this is kind of like Moondrop SSR on steroids. So it's more bass, more treble, but kind of a similar tune where it's got a bit of mid bass to support it, but mostly this is a top end focused sound. So what I like about the sound here on the Cayin Fantasy, honestly, the bass quality on this thing is pretty decent. Like I said, it's not a lot of bass, but kind of like the Moondrop SSR, I think the bass that's done here is pretty solid. Again, it's mid-bass focused more so than sub-bass, so maybe not super rumbly, but it's got a nice punch to it. It gives the sound a decent body, and it's decently quick. It's not very slow. It doesn't have any issues with muddying up the mid-range or anything like that. I think that the bass on here, pretty solid. And then I think also the imaging on this is actually pretty solid. Again, kind of like the Moondrop SSR. It just does a pretty good job with that sense of space, that sense of 3D-ness, which, is not true of some of the other IMs that we're going to talk about in a second. And so that much, I thought the Fantasy actually did a pretty good job with. Now, what do I not like about the sound in the Fantasy? Unfortunately, this thing is way too bright. Way too bright. Yeah, I talked about this thing being a bright V with more treble emphasis than bass emphasis, and frankly, that was probably an understatement. This thing is just got way too much treble, and I try not to judge an IEM based on its frequency response, but just one look at the frequency response I think will give you a pretty good idea. If you're interested in checking that frequency response out, I do have a link in the description. I'm not going to pull that up on camera right now, but use your imagination, take a look at that that frequency response, and you'll see that this is just a very, very brightly tuned earphone. A lot of treble, which in my experience causes kind of two main issues. Issue number one is just the tonal balance. I think that there's so much upper mid-range and treble emphasis here on the Fantasy that it gives the overall tone just a really strong sense of thinness, but also kind of a shrillness to vocals. I think vocals lack body, and they feel overly kind of like breathy and nasally, like they feel like they're really, really on top of you. A lot of, I don't know if this is even gonna come through on my microphone, but imagine if I was just talking like this all the time, and that was disgusting. But that's kind of what this sounds like, and it's really, in my experience, pretty unpleasant. One of the more unpleasant characteristics to a tuning, a sound signature that I've ever experienced. And then sort of that second problem, I mentioned there were kind of two problems that this caused. The second problem that emphasis in the treble comes with is just, it's honestly uncomfortable to listen to a lot of the times. I think, things like sharp cymbal strikes, and there's a lot of music out there that has fairly sharp cymbal strikes, are just going to make you wince. They make me wince when I listen to this. Okay, I don't want to say it'll make you wince. I don't know what your experience will be, but my experience was listening to the Fantasy. It was quite painful, honestly, with certain music. There's some other music that I've got if you want to check this stuff out. It's like electronic stuff that it's not necessarily cymbals, but it's got like this wispy treble in it. There's a couple of Mondo Grosso albums and a Blood Orange album that I've been listening to lately, and the treble in them, honestly, part of it is the mix. Those songs are a little bit too hot in the treble, but on this set, like, I don't like to use this word lightly. In fact, I almost never use this word, and it's maybe even a bit of an exaggeration at this point, but I would say that the Fantasy with those albums is unlistenable. Like, I don't want to listen to it. So there's that. And then the other problem, even if you're not listening to cymbal strikes or those particular albums that are a little bit hot in the treble, is that it really is pretty bad with sibilance. And if you want, some examples of albums that are pretty bad with sibilance and that will bring out, the issues here with the tuning, a lot of erasure, frankly, vocals and erasure. Fairly sibilant. Yazoo, pretty sibilant vocals, and honestly, that was kind of a pain to listen to here on the Fantasy, if I'm perfectly honest. So that is roughly what I think about the sound. But how does that compare to those other IMs that I mentioned, the Dunu Zen and the Moondrop Illumination? Let's go back to the table for some rankings, and let's move some things out of the way, make some room. That kind of worked. All right, make some room for the Dunu Zen, the Moondrop Illumination. Round of applause, everybody. I don't know why I said that. Don't applaud them. They're just IMs. They can't hear you. You hear them. But anyway, all right, let's rank these in a couple of different categories. I don't have a lot of categories here, honestly, but it just to give you a sense of how these things stack up in terms of imaging, sort of that 3D sense and how strong the separation is between instruments and stuff like that. Honestly, I would say the Fantasy might be the strongest. The Zen is not too far behind, but I would say that's next. And then the Illumination, that is its biggest weakness, is just that sense of depth and 3D-ness. I found here in the Illumination pretty weak. So Fantasy, maybe it's because of that treble emphasis, and maybe it's because of that dual cavity acoustic design. I don't know what's going on, but it does a pretty good job of that. So we'll give it that to the Fantasy. In terms of bass, however, I'm going to say the Dunu Zen is the clear winner in terms of bass. Like, it's just, that's this thing's trick. It's not necessarily the best tuning or the best imaging, although it's decent there. The bass quality here is just really super. Again, I call it kind of like this percussive characteristic to it, which is really quite nice. And then between these two, I think I'm gonna go ahead and rank the Illumination as second. Just really nice bass tuning, and maybe not the strongest in terms of body and again depth, like for that 3D effect. But generally, I thought the bass here was pretty good, and honestly, the Fantasy bass was not that bad. Pretty solid bass. You could even make an argument that the bass on the Fantasy is even a little bit more engaging than the Illumination, although I think just for tuning wise, I think that the Illumination is a little bit stronger because it doesn't so much roll off into the sub bass. And now finally, I think the last category I want to rank these things in is just in tuning, the general tonality, and that's where I think the Moondrop Illumination takes first place. And the Dunu Zen is a pretty solid set, although, you know, it's not the most natural sounding set. This is kind of a bit of a V-shaped signature. The tuning on the Illumination is fantastic. It's a shame about the imaging and the 3D depth because it's kind of weak there, but the tuning, phenomenal. Tuning on the Zen, I think, is pretty decent. Not my total preference, but it'll get you by. And then, unfortunately, the Fantasy, if we're just talking about tuning, I should probably just like put this way down here because that treble tuning that's a bit of a yikes. So out of 5 stars, and this is why this video is ostensibly titled A First for Everything. Out of 5 stars, I'm gonna have to give the Cayin Fantasy. Did the animation break? Oh no, it didn't get stuck. It's just 1 star. I just can't imagine, like there's obviously some good things that I've said about the sound here, and so it really is kind of a shame that the treble tuning on this thing is so nuts and so just like frankly unlistenable. It's harsh enough that like I honestly was not totally convinced that it wasn't like a broken unit or anything like that, but I looked at some other frequency response measurements out there on the internet. They seem to be in line with my measurements, so I think this is pretty representative of what the Cayin Fantasy sounds like. And unfortunately, as much as I like Cayin's digital audio players, I do not like the Fantasy. So that said, if you're interested in checking it out, of course, I got a link in the description down below, and shout out to Cayin for sending this in for review. While you're down there, if you found this video helpful, you liked it, please do hit the like button. Helps me out. Subscribe to the channel. Ding the YouTube bell if you haven't already, and then I'll see you on the next super review. And if you're here live, let's have a chat. All right, let me catch up with chat as best as possible. Yeah, that was the Fantasy, a first for everything. My first 1-star score. Do the early shout outs. Big Boss, how you doing? Omar, what's up? Muhammad Arabi, alo, how you doing? Lucas Eduardo, nice to see you. And Scott Pledger, nice to see you there as well again. Cheebs, 1 star. You predicted 1 star early. You know what? So Cheebs is a member of the Discord community. If you're not already there, there's a link to my Discord in the description down below. Cheebs had a pretty good sense that this might be a 1 star based on what we've been talking about over the past couple of weeks. Benjamin a la Cruz saying KXXS plus Illumination equals Fantasy. Yeah, I think there is actually a lot of similarities. Like if you were to just look at the design of something like the Illumination and the Moondrop KXXS, you could imagine that the Fantasy would be the physical result, hopefully not the tuning result of that. But yeah. David K saying maybe I'm just a poor bloke, but I can't imagine spending that much on an IM. And I don't blame you at all. I think the most I've spent on an IM is I bought my Moondrop S8. I bought it used for $450, which was a lot, right? That was a thing where I heard it and I was like, I really need that in my life, and started just thinking of all the different ways to justify it to myself. But yeah, that was a lot for me. And these are obviously more expensive at, $700 and $800 each. That said, I've heard some stuff that, I struggle to say it's worth it, but like, if that's what you want and it's only available at that price, then it can be worth it. Yeah, obviously the Fantasy I don't think is worth $800. In fact, when I was doing the rankings and the comparisons before, when I was kind of prepping for it, I actually considered including the Moondrop SSR in that ranking. I didn't want to be like a dick, but like the $40 Moondrop SSR is honestly much better than the Cayin Fantasy. So obviously price does not equal quality. Adnan greetings from Bangladesh again. Nice to see you again. 5 a.m. So burning the midnight oil. Wow. I usually wake up at 6 a.m. So you're an hour away from my alarm clock. Good luck. Cheeb's asking ZS10 Pro versus Fantasy. I would pick the ZS10 Pro. Victor saying, I got them. Tell us more, Victor. Not even a decent case and just one cable for 3.5 millimeter for $800 plus taxes and shipping. Blonde 05 overpriced. Koopa Game Lauda saying, I like that cable. Yeah, honestly, like the cable here on the Fantasy is pretty nice. I don't imagine I will spend much time listening to the Fantasy after this review, but there's a good chance I will steal this cable and put it on something else because it is a nice looking cable. I even like this termination. Like, you know, maybe I wish it wasn't super glossy and fingerprinty, but that's a pretty small complaint. Oh, Victor, so you didn't buy the Fantasy. They sent it to you for review, and then you sent me, ostensibly, you might have sent me the other one. Interesting. Nodmin asking, does it scratch? I mean, I'll zoom in on this so you can take a look. I don't have any scratches on mine, but I also haven't like put it to the scratch test, and I'm not jerry-rig everything, so I'm not really interested in doing that, but I don't know. I'm not too worried about it personally, and maybe it's just my general disposition is I'm not too worried about babying my IEMs or most of the things I own. Like I try to take care of things I own, but I also try to just use them. And if taking care of it comes at the expense of me wanting to use it, which can be the case with like, you know, if I'm trying to be so careful about not scratching these that I'm afraid of, you know, winding it up and twisting it and letting them dangle like this, and then I just don't want to really use it. And so that's kind of like the end of where I'm, you know, careful with things. But generally I'm pretty careful, and there's no scratches on these things so far. I mean, I don't know. I imagine like anything shiny, scratching is definitely a risk. But if you take care of your stuff, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Omar telling me to stop being nice. I don't think I'm being too nice with the Fantasy, but I'm being perfectly honest. There are certain aspects of this sound that are honestly like appealing. With certain music, if there's music that I'm listening to that's just not very bright in the mix, it can sound pretty decent here on the Fantasy. But if there's music that has cymbal strikes or people talking with the S sound or you know, it's just got some nutty electronic treble, it's probably not going to be very comfortable. Where One Nation saying $800 for sharp treble is pure robbery. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I steer away from words like robbery. You know, this is, you know, ostensibly a product that somebody put some amount of care into and thought that they had done a good job, I guess. But it is kind of hard to believe that someone listened to this and thought that this product is ready for prime time. Hence the 1-star review. Like, I've talked about this a little bit before, and I guess I haven't put this down on paper, so this is still maybe a little bit loosely defined, but a little bit about how I use my star scores. Like 5 for me is like a defining thing in its price range, right? A 5-star $50 product, probably not as good as, well, not necessarily as good as a 5-star $300 product, but 5 stars for me means like in that price range, that's the best I've heard. 4-star means I still really like it. Maybe not my absolute favorite. Maybe there's something about it that I don't love, but I think that's a really good set and easy to recommend. A 3-star generally means it's not really for me, but I could see why it could be for somebody else. And I'm not, if someone tells me that they're interested in like a 3-star product, or if they're telling me that they're interested in a product and I'm not going to immediately say, to me, that's like a 3-star, right? It's like, then there's kind of a range in 3 stars, honestly. Like some 3-star stuff, I actually kind of like a little bit more than some others. The Sennheiser IE300 is kind of a good example where the tuning on that is definitely not my thing. And I don't think it's quite worth the $300 asking price, but there are some things about that earphone I like. So I'm like, yeah, 3 stars, that's about right for that. 2 stars for me is where I get to the point where if someone says they're interested in a product that I think is a 2-star product, to me that means I gotta steer them away from it. Like I would steer away from something like the BGVP NS9. Like I just wouldn't really recommend it to anybody. And then a 1-star, this is the first time I've done a 1-star. I've kind of been reserving it for a couple of reasons. One was the running joke that I didn't have the graphic made, which was a true story. I actually had to make this graphic in order to give a 1-star review because I'd never done it before. But the other thing was like, for me, 1-star just means like it's kind of broken, right? And not like a manufacturing defect broken, but like the product comes and it doesn't do what it should be doing. And that's kind of where I feel like the Fantasy lands. Is the tuning on this thing is, it doesn't seem intentional, if I'm perfectly honest. But based on frequency response graphs that I've seen elsewhere on the internet, I think I'm pretty confident this is representative of what the Fantasy is, hence the 1-star score. So, and Omar asking which Blood Orange album. What is the name of the album I've been listening to? Oof, I don't remember the name of the album. Hold on. Actually, we can do this in real time on, right. Oh, look at that. We've got it loaded up. It's this album. Cupid Deluxe. Really good album, by the way. I see you followed up. You also asked how would I rank his discography. To be honest, that's the only album I've spent much time listening to. I've somewhat recently been listening to, I think, his newest album, which isn't that new, but I think I started listening to that once I got Apple Music because now I can just kind of stream whatever, but I didn't spend too much time listening to it. This is the one that I've listened to thoroughly. Gotcha, Boba, saying just a little EQ and foams equals gold. Maybe, but probably not. I'm trying to remember if I did play around with foams on this thing. I don't think I did. I actually honestly don't remember. I played around with foams on some IM. Maybe it was this one. What I do remember for certain, though, is I did play around with Tanchjim filters. So Tanchjim, they make some other IMs that often come with these little tuning filters, and they will actually affect the frequency response of an IM if you put it on. I put it on these just to check it out. And it did have the effect of dropping the upper mid-range and the treble by a few dB. Pretty significant, to be honest, but it did not save it at all. It was still pretty unpleasant to listen to. In the Discord chat, we were joking, maybe if we stacked on like 10 of them, it might get to a listenable point. Maybe now I'm being a dick. Kaede, nice to see you. Even though you joined late, that's fine. And Nonman asking, could EQ help? I mean, if you applied a really heavy amount of EQ to this, you might be able to fix it. I'll be perfectly honest though, I did not play around with EQ, so I don't have the experience of, I can't tell you like what a recipe is and if it actually saves it. I have a feeling, I'm sure if you had a parametric EQ, you can get pretty surgical with it. And you just really focus in on like that 5, like say like 4.5 to like 6.5K. Yeah, I think 4.5 to like 6.5K. Just really focus in on that and drop it down by talking like 10 decibels. And that might help. But I didn't try it out. What's up, Recode? How you doing? Trumpion. Nandro giving me a dab. That was a text-based dab, but I think that's a worthy dab as well. Cheeb saying 1 star, this is an achievement. Yeah, I mean, the fantasy motivated me to create a graphic that I hadn't made before. Ugh. Juan Roque, how you doing? Nice to see you there. Muhammad Rabi saying, for a person who heavily prefers tonality over technical details, is there any point in getting higher end IEMs over $200? I guess it depends on like how particular you are about the tonality, and if you've already found the IEM that does it for you exactly, like let's say something like the Etymotic ER2XR, you can get for around $100, maybe even less, and its tuning is just it's almost perfect, honestly. Not super strong in the technicalities, but not bad. But yeah, if you're only after tonality, you could definitely be done there. That said, if that's not your ideal tonality and your ideal tonality doesn't exist under $200, obviously you're gonna have to go out. I do think the Moondrop Blessing 2, it's at $300. I think that for me is kind of the best tuning I've heard of any IEM. Even some stuff that's more expensive. So if all I was after was tonality, I would basically be done with the Moondrop Blessing 2. I tweeted Camp saying, should I get the Freya or the Mangard T? Anyone with an opinion, please say it. I want to say, please don't get the Freya. So I talked about my 2-star ratings, meaning I'm going to steer somebody away from it. The Moondrop, the Canara Freya, I gave that one 2 stars. I would not recommend that one. The Mangard T, that's a pretty decent set. And so if those are your 2 options, I would definitely go with the Mangard. Ymir Sharif asking, did I try any foam tips? I didn't actually try any foam tips. I think, if I was being really particular about this, I could probably dive in and try, like, foam tips might cut the treble a little bit. Again, some EQ might cut the treble. The tangent filters, they did cut the treble a little bit. And you could start stacking on all these effects. At some point, you're gonna be attenuating more of the sound than just the treble and probably causing issues for some of the technical performance. So I didn't go that far down that rabbit hole. I will say that the tangent filters, I believe, attenuate more treble than a foam ear tip will. And it still definitely was not enough. Scott Pleasure saying, wow, that's rough, $800 and only 1 star. So if you do math, $800 per star, let's see, 8 times 5 equals too much math for me. But yeah, that's an expensive 5-star IEM. Adam Mobius saying, talking about the Moondrop SSR, would EQing it worsen its technicalities? Starting to appreciate my SSR more after hearing your constant praise of it. It's a good sleeping IEM. Yeah, I don't. So just for starters, I don't play around with EQ that much. So take this with a grain of salt. I also imagine there's different software is going to apply EQ in different ways. So depending on what you do to the frequency response with your EQ, there are some ways that you could ruin the technicalities. Let's say like you just wanted to boost the bass. You could actually inadvertently cause clipping in sort of the digital signal by boosting the loudness of the bass. If you're not If you're, yeah, basically, and maybe this is a bit of an outdated superstition or hypothesis, but again, this is probably going to really vary depending on which EQ software you're using. Let's say everything in your sound stack is going through at neutral volume, and that's basically at 100% volume. If you boost the bass, right, you are effectively pushing that past 100%, and you could be causing clipping. A lot of EQ software is smart about it, and it will kind of lower like when you boost the bass, it actually just lowers everything else, and that's kind of like cutting versus boosting. And I think the general wisdom is that cutting is a better way of EQing your stuff to avoid clipping. So generally, I would say if you stick to cutting or you use software that avoids that problem, then we're talking about something different. And honestly, like I don't think that you're really going to damage the technical performance of an IEM just by changing the frequency response, because effectively what you're doing is you're changing the source, right? You're not actually changing your earphone. When you boost bass or you cut treble or something like that, right? You're not physically changing anything about the transducer that's in your ear. You're changing something about it's basically a filter for the audio before it gets to your transducer, right? So if you listen to music it's not bright, and there's some music that's like recorded and mastered bright and some music that's not, that's kind of like the same equivalent of listening to a bright album but with an EQ that's cut the brightness down, is you're basically just kind of listening to the not bright album, but it's being applied globally to everything. So I don't think, yeah. So basically the answer is, as long as you're not boosting and causing clipping, I don't think you have to worry about any damage to the technical performance of your IM. That said, if you're EQing stuff and changing tonal balances, there might be gaps in the technical performance that you might not have noticed, that once that part of the frequency response is more prominent, you will begin to notice. For example, like if I boost the bass on the Sennheiser HD 600, not a bassy headphone, if I cut everything except the bass, even if I avoid boosting and I just cut everything but the bass, I think the quality of the bass is going to stand out, and it's not the best quality bass. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question. And again, that is from the perspective of someone who doesn't actually use EQ very much. Triple O Excellence asking, quick question: what are the best IMs under $50 in my opinion? I've got a good answer for you. I've got a bad answer for you, but a good answer for you. So I've been building this site, squig.link. If you haven't checked it out before, check it out. It's where I put frequency response graphs of all the IMs that I review. But I've also been building out a new section of SquigLink, which I'm calling the Squig List. So just look in the header and the navigation at squig.link, or you can go to squig.link/list. And there I've been building out basically a list of all of the IMs that I have reviewed and measured and have on SquigLink. They are ordered by price or into certain little price brackets. So if you wanted to shop for the best IMs that I've heard under $50, you can use that tool to figure it out. And then I've also got links to the frequency response graphs and the reviews in that same place. Basically trying to put together a nice shopping tool. Scott Pledger asking, so that begs the question, this or a random generic $20 earbuds sold at airports everywhere? That's a rough question, to be perfectly honest, because that $20 earbud could be a really wide range of things. If you want to get very specific, there is a $10 earbud that my buddy Sean sent me. That's a Philips, I believe. I want to say it's a Philips IM. $10 Philips IM on Amazon, and I would rather listen to that than the Cayin Fantasy. Would I rather listen to every $20 IM sold at the airport? I don't know. That's a really open question, but I can say for certainty that $10 IM I would rather listen to. It's definitely not built as nice though. Kaede asking, am I going to check out the budget campfire IMs? I'm pretty interested to be honest. I shot Campfire a message to see if they'd be interested in sending me them for a review, but I haven't heard back from them yet. So there's a good chance I won't be able to hear them. Unfortunately, I don't have a budget for it right now. Adrian Barossa asking, just wondering what are my favorite headphones and what headphones or IMs do I listen to the most? I mean, my favorite headphone is still probably the Sennheiser HD600. I don't know what to say. It's just a really good set, not for bass heads. In fact, not even for bass lovers. The bass on it's a little bit weak, but the mid-range is just so nice. For IMs, probably the Moondrop S8 and the Moondrop Blessing 2 would be my top two. Susie Bonna asking, what's the best and worst quality control that I've experienced? I don't think I've experienced enough IMs from any particular manufacturer to really have a good sense of like how well they do with quality control. I think you need to really get a good sense of that. You just need to pay more attention to forums and like how often are people reporting problems. I mean, I can say that recently I unboxed the Eco OH1S, and out of those 2 units, I had actually 3 quality control problems. So that was not great, but I've also had a couple of different Eco IMs in the past and never had any issues with those. So I don't know if it was just that lot. There was some issue with the manufacturing. I don't think the Eco necessarily has an issue with manufacturing. So again, I don't think I have enough data points to really make an educated statement on that. Sven Hoff saying my FH3 arrived today and I would love them already at 1/6 of the price. I assume you're talking about versus the Fantasy. How would they compare? The FH3 is much better than the Fantasy. Don't worry. Scott asking, you forget, have I reviewed the U12T? So the 64 audio U12T. And yes, I have actually. It was maybe 2 months ago or so. I reviewed a handful of different 64 audio IMs, including the U12T, the Neo, the U18T, the Forte, and the Trio. And out of those 5, for me, the U12T and the Trio were my 2 favorites. And Triple O Excellence saying, I wonder if there are any open backs with lower frequencies that appear as if they're closed backs. Yeah, that's a good question, right? And it's actually kind of an interesting thing. I've actually recently, let me reach over and grab this. So recently got this set. This is the Sendy Iva, was sent to me for review, and I'm evaluating this right now. Which has got me listening to headphones again recently. And going to the headphones, one thing that kind of stands out coming from IEMs, especially things that I've been reviewing lately, like the Moondrop variations, coming from IEMs, it's very obvious how much less sub bass there is in open back headphones. Like even a set that has pretty linear bass, and the Sendy Iva does actually have pretty good bass. Even with a set like that, the difference in the sub bass presentation to something like the Moondrop variations, or even, a set that's not as bassy, even like something like the Moondrop Blessing 2, if I'm perfectly honest, like that feels to me like a stronger sub bass emphasis than pretty much any open back headphones that I've heard. Now, I've not heard a lot of open back headphones. I mean, I've probably heard more than the average person, but I haven't heard as many open back headphones as I have heard IM. So I don't have a great recommendation for you if you're looking for an open back headphone that has commensurate sub bass. I think, something like the Fidelio X2, as I recall, it's been a while since I listened to it, but as I recall, fairly sub bassy open back headphone, but even then I still think it's not quite on the same level. It is a different presentation. There are certain things about the bass on these open back headphones that is, I don't want to say necessarily better, but maybe bigger. Even if it's not so much like the tonal balance, there's just a sense of feel that you get from an open back headphone that has a fairly linear bass response. But in terms of giving you that really deep rumble with that really dominant sub bass focus, like I haven't heard anything open back that's anywhere on the level of some IEMs, and even closed back headphones. Scott asking, how would I rank the U12T versus the S8 and the Blessing 2? So that is a tough one. For more detail on the S8 versus Blessing 2, you could watch my review because I'm pretty sure I compared them extensively in that. Here's what I'll say. The first time I heard the 64 Audio U12T, I was more impressed with it than I expected to be. I was going into listening to the first, I think at the time, the most expensive earphone I had heard was probably something like the Dunu SA6, which is around $500. So this is the first time I heard an earphone that cost over $1,000. And I went into it kind of with the bias that there's no IEM that's worth this much money. This is just a silly amount of money to spend. But when I heard it, I was like, I get it. I heard some other more expensive IEMs even at that same time, and I was like, okay, maybe some of these are pretty good, but none of them are tempting. But this U12T, $2,000 is a lot of money to spend, but it sounds so good that it's really tempting. So that was how I felt about the U12T. And if I'm perfectly honest, I even started talking to my wife saying, hey, here's this IEM that I'm thinking about getting. What do you think about it? And she's like, wow, that sounds pretty dumb, but so basically I was at this point where I was buttering up my wife for the potential of me making this purchase. I was looking around on the internet, finding, where could I find this thing on sale? Where can I find it used? How could I use my Dropbucks to buy it? Stuff like that. I was making plans to buy the U12T, but then maybe a month or so later, I heard the Moondrop S8, and the S8, honestly, I was like, this makes more sense to me. It's hard to compare them, directly because they are so different tonally. I think tonal preference, the S8 is closer to my preference because it's more forward and a brighter tune. The vocals on the U12T are not my favorite tuning. It's a bit of a bassy set, bassier than I usually like. Where the S8 is a little closer to my tonal preferences. And then on top of that, the technical performance of the S8, maybe not in every category is it the same as the U12T, but in the things that I value, the thing that really impressed me about the U12T, I felt like the Moondrop S8 gave me that same effect. And so when I found out I could get the S8 for much cheaper, I basically stopped being that interested in the U12T. I still love that earphone. I would, if someone wanted to give me one or sell me one for really cheap, I'd be pretty tempted. But the Moondrop S8 does for me what I wanted out of the U12T at less than half the cost. So there's that. And then S8 versus Blessing 2, honestly, I mentioned this during the Cayin review or the Fantasy review, I think. The Blessing 2 is my favorite tonal balance. That is just perfect tuning for me. And in fact, I like the tuning on the Blessing 2 better than the tuning on the S8. The S8's a little bit thin in the mid-range, and a little bit weak in the mid-bass. So yeah, I think the Blessing 2 is better in the tonal department, but I think the treble quality on the S8 is so much better that, and the fit, honestly, on the S8 is better for my ear, that I will go to listen to the S8 just much more often. Albert Christian asking, what genre dominates my playlist? That's a good question. I'll just say for starters, I'm really bad at genres. I don't know. Maybe I'm just really bad at classification in general because I have a hard time drawing the line between things. But the The artists that I've been listening to a lot lately would be Men I Trust, Cigarettes After Sex, Sublime, Smashing Pumpkins, Erasure. I do like a lot of electronic. For a long time, and I still do tend to gravitate toward this kind of music, is I like electronic music with female vocals. So things like Churches, Men I Trust is a good example. Purity Ring. I haven't been listening to a lot of Churches and Purity Ring for a while, just because I don't have any new albums by them. But if there was like one genre or one theme that was maybe the most dominant in my music library, it would be electronic music with female vocals. Yazoo is another example. Kevin Ing asking, have I ever tried a custom IM? And if so, is it worth it compared to universal fits? I haven't done anything with custom fit IMs. And part of it is a bit of a commitment aversion. Like, you know, custom IMs, most of them are pretty expensive, and then you got to pay for the impressions, and then you got to pay for the custom build, and then you got to hope that it actually fits you, because from what I've heard, a lot of the times, like, they'll send you the custom built, and maybe it's not quite right, and so there's like this sending back and forth. And so part of why I haven't gone down that route is it's just a lot of commitment up front for a thing that I'm not certain I will love at the end, right? The other thing is that honestly, like universal fit IMs, I don't have a problem with them. Like I don't need the security of a custom fit. Maybe if there was a particular IM that I had that I love the sound of it, but I had issues with the fit, I would go the direction of getting a custom version of it. Or there are certain IMs that the tuning in a custom version is a little bit different than the universal version. And if that was what I wanted, was that exact tuning, I would go that route. But I'll say that I have not yet found the motivation to go down that route and make that commitment. Yeah. And part of it too is like I like being able to share IMs with other people and say, hey, I'm hearing this thing, check it out. What do you think about it? And when you've got a custom, like it's not really an option. You can't really let other people hear what you're hearing. Triple O Excellent saying on the Squig list, the Moondrop Crescent is rated highest on the list under $50. Yeah. Based on what you're looking at, yeah. Do I recommend it over the Blonde BL05S? I haven't heard the 5S. I've heard the BL05, and I do prefer the Moondrop Crescent quite a bit. Unfortunately, I have no idea where to buy the Moondrop Crescent anymore. So if you can find the Crescent out there, I totally still recommend the Crescent. It is an outstanding sounding IM. Unfortunately, it's just not really available anywhere. Scott Pledger with the super chat. Appreciate it. Just a quick thanks for all the awesome info and great work. Hey, thanks for the conversation and the super chat. And then earlier, Scott, you were saying, I'd love to see a well-tuned open back IM. I'd use them daily on my commute, tuned from work, so I can still hear what's going on around me. Yeah, I know. There are like the Odyssey iSigns. I believe those are technically open back planars. You said you did call out well-tuned, and from what I understand, they require EQ to correct their tuning, but maybe that's an okay solution. But yeah, honestly, there's not a lot of IMs that are especially open. Although now that we've got this on the table, I will call out that the Moondrop Illumination is actually probably the most open IM that I've got. It's got these vents in it. Let's see if we can take a look there. And because of that, these really do not seal outside sound that much. If you were looking for an IM, and this is very, very well tuned, not necessarily strong in the technical performance, but very well tuned. If you're looking for a well-tuned IM that will let you hear your surroundings, the Illumination is actually not a bad choice there. Or you can get the Koss KSC 75. Seriously, check it out. No, Scott, you said when you bought your U12T, you did not tell your fiance how much they cost. It's probably for the best. And hopefully your fiance has some secrets of their own. Susie Bond saying, if you're a dynamic driver bass person, would the Moondrop Blessing 2 Dusk make the SA6 obsolete? I have the SA6. Everything is great except for the BA bass. If I had the DD bass, it would be perfect. I personally prefer listening to the Dusk versus the SA6, and a lot of it comes down to the dynamic driver bass. I will say that the SA6, I think the treble performance on the SA6 is better than the Blessing and the Dusk. So if you go from SA6 to the Blessing to the Dusk, I think you'll get most of what you're looking for. Just know that the treble won't be quite there. And that's just because the SA6 treble is really quite good. But yeah. Don Trumpion saying, when I got the Laylas, I used the first Trump Bucks check, so it came out to $100. That's not a bad discount. Ava Joshi asking, did I like the Campfire Andromedas? And yes, so I've heard both the Andromeda 2020s, which is I think the latest model, as well as the previous model, and in between them they changed some things about the frequency response. I thought the newest one was actually really solid. Like, I would consider buying that one. It's $1,000, I think, maybe $1,100, so it's not cheap. But that was a pretty tempting sound, if I'm perfectly honest. The older one was not bad either, but it was a little bit too kind of muted and veiled in the upper mid-range. Neither of them is very upper mid-range forward or anything like that, but I did find that the tweak that they made with the latest version, to me, brings it more in line with my preferences and counteracts some of the trebliness of it. Oh, Kevin, so you're saying you have small ears and you usually struggle with universal fit IMs. There's another really good reason to go the custom route. Although there are some small IMs that you can, look into. It can be frustrating to have to limit yourself to a much smaller subset of the market just because the IM is too large for your ear. And there's certain IMs that are too large for my ears as well. The Thea Audio Monarch, like in the Clairvoyance, I can't really comfortably listen to those because of how large they are. Hiren, you're late, but that's okay. Nice to see you. Yamir Sharif, I have not tried the FiO FA9. And yes, Hiren, if you could get the 64 Audio Trio for something a little bit less than $2,300, that would be nice. It's a very good sounding earphone. I miss it, but I can't imagine paying $2,300. That's a hard pill to swallow. Sven Hoff, will I test the new Qtelix QX over ear? I'm not familiar with that. Oh, and Scott, you clarified that the Odyssey eye signs were exactly why you specified well-tuned. I get it. And if you have not checked out the KSC 75 yet, you owe it to yourself. It's $20, maybe $15 on Amazon. You can get it tomorrow. And I mean, the cable will be bad, but everything else is pretty okay. I don't want to say everything else. The sound is pretty phenomenal. Vesquex, which music do I listen to? Check out the channel. Look for the playlists tab on my YouTube page, and I've got a playlist of just a bunch of music that I like to listen to. And Triple O Excellence, yes, I actually did a review of the AirPods Max about 6 months ago. I actually thought it was a pretty good sounding set. My biggest problem with the AirPods Max actually had nothing to do with the sound, and it had everything to do with the fact that case, like, I know people made fun of the case because it looks silly. I don't care what it looks like. I just can't believe that case is essentially a required component of the headphone. Like, you have to use that case, or the battery's going to drain itself, or you're just going to get weird connectivity things. Like, I had my headphones in another room picking up phone calls for me. And Recode asking, between the Z1R, the Sony Z1R, and the Monarch, which one fits better in my ear? My ear, personally, the Z1R was actually fine. I think they both have a reputation for being large, and I think the Z1R probably has the bigger reputation for being a large IM. So I was actually kind of surprised when I was testing the Monarch and found out how uncomfortable it was for me. But it was like uncomfortable for me. The Monarch for me was like large in this sense, and so it caused pressure right here, and I had a hard time fitting at my ear because of here. The Sony Z1R, it's large in the nozzle, or like kind of like the entry, or let's go here to the table. The Sony Z1R is large in like this area, and the effect that has is that in basically the entry to the ear canal can be too large on the Z1R. For me, I didn't have that issue, but I had an issue with my conchas. My conchas are small. I'm a little self-conscious about it, but apparently my ear canal entry is not that small. Maybe it's been stretched out by the Moondrop blessing. Oh, and Scott with a good recommendation for the small ears is the Sennheiser IE300. There's the Etymotic stuff, obviously, is quite small. Finals earphones are pretty small. Moondrop SSR are very small. A lot of the bullet style stuff, Tantrum Darling. There are some small options out there, but yeah, if you don't like any of those options and you want something else, then custom, you got to do it. All right, folks, I think that's gonna do it though. I want to thank you all for hanging around and having a chat. And if you want to continue the chat, always suggest joining the Discord, which I do have linked in the description down below. But while you're down there, if you haven't already, please do hit that like button. Helps me out. Subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and then say something nice to somebody you talk to. And I'll catch you in the next super review. Cheers.